Hello, and welcome to the Big Book Club, the fourth edition of the Big Book Club. This month we read The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, which I read with Sunny from Sunny Book Nook, whose all their information is linked in the description down below. They are running a little bit late, but they did say they should be here in a minute. So we'll be able to get started talking about this book. But if you haven't read it, I suppose I can tell you a little bit about what it's about. So this is the book in which Naomi Klein, who is a journalist who writes about politics, and particularly she's focused on climate change now, although this is not a climate change book. This is where she coined the term disaster capitalism, which is basically where big conglomerates and governments take advantage of a disaster in order to push through neoliberal economic policies that will benefit the few, whilst having a big effect on those who do not have the same advantages. So it is bad for the people and good for the few. And in this book, she covers a large range of different places geographically and also chronologically, charting the history of the Shock Doctrine or disaster capitalism. So have any of you who are here, have you all read it, or are you just here to see what we think of it and our discussion of the themes without having read it? What do you think? I have read Naomi Klein before. I have read This Changes Everything, which is one of her climate change books, and I really enjoyed it. Sunny is here now. You've read most of it. Okay. What did you think? Were you a fan? Did you enjoy it?
Hi.
Hi. Hi. How are you? You're all right?
Yes, I am. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. It's a lot darker in here than I thought it was going to be at this time. But yeah, I'm good. You all settled in?
Yeah.
Okay. So I introduced the book already. I was talking a little bit about what it's about and the idea of disaster capitalism, what that is. But normally at the start of this, I get my guests to introduce themselves. So if you want to tell us a little bit about your channel and what you generally read and your favorite big book.
Yes. So here's my copy. But I am a Sunny Book Nook, and my name is Sunny. I read a lot of everything. A lot of literary fiction and speculative fiction, and of course nonfiction. And my favorite big book, I think a recent big book, or a big book that I'm in the middle of reading, is the second book in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and that's like a high fantasy, and it's like it's one of those like huge fantasy tomes that are usually really intimidating to me, but I'm really enjoying this. So yeah, I would say that's a big book that I'm liking. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, those fantasy books tend to be the more common ones to get like huge chunky books. Okay, so we've got some people here saying they had a hard time getting through it. They don't know a ton of general history. Yeah, I think that it is quite like it expects you to know quite a lot of recent history. I think it doesn't like give you a grounding in that. And you haven't, and Rebecca hasn't read any Naomi Klein, so I hope you enjoy our discussion of it anyway. So what did you think generally? What was your sort of general overview? Did you enjoy it?
Yes, I thought it was very good. I think like the sort of the reviews on the back of my copy kind of speak to I think what's most important, or like speaks to the meaningful and impactful sort of elements of this. I think like where like how Arundhati Roy like says a brilliant, brave, and terrifying book. It's nothing less than the secret history of what we call the free market. It should be compulsory reading. And I thought that was like I think that was a good summation of what was happening here. And I think like this is really good journalism ultimately. And I think like that's also why there's not a lot of like historical context or explanation happening, because that's what journalism tends to do. Like it doesn't really, most of the time I feel like it's I think she provides more of a framework of like thinking and analysis rather than a broad or like understanding of like the history of the whatever place that she's talking about, I guess, or instance, or like political history, I guess. Yeah.
I enjoyed that about this work as well, that she's more of a journalist. I think in two regards. I think I often find when there is a non-fiction book and I'm interested in the topic, they do tend to give too much of like that broad overview and not enough of the analysis, which is more what I'm interested in reading, particularly if it's one that I'm more aware of the context, like it's something that I'm already a little bit familiar with, then what I want is that analysis and that more depth. And I think a lot of popular nonfiction is more broad, which I understand, because if people want a basic introduction into something, that's what you need. The other reason I think that she's such a great journalist is that she's really good at marrying like facts and statistics with like a narrative and a way of helping you to be like drawn into what she's saying, to like keep a hold of the theory in your head, because she's like tying it to the story of actual people, or she's like explaining like chronologically in some ways, but she just is good at telling a story at the same time as analyzing what's going on. And I think that for me that's her biggest strength, is the way she like makes it a story and makes it accessible, even though she is talking more analytically and more like in depth than some of the other more popular nonfiction.
Yeah, for sure. Like she gets into the specifics, but couching it within like a narrative, and doesn't just say like she really makes general statements and sort of repeats her thesis a lot, but like after and in between, and like using the specific points and instances to prove said thesis, like that's what the whole nature of like the book is. Like I even like the subtitle of like the rise of disaster capitalism, like her delineation of like world history in the past like 50 years, how what she's like she defines like disaster capitalism and like what the shock doctrine is, and then like how what it looks like and how it has risen essentially. And it's like that's why it's like a big book. That's why it gets into specifics and stuff, I think.
I think there was just one chapter, the shock therapy in the USA. That chapter had so many numbers in it that I was like, I'm lost now. It was like, and he earned this much from his like profiteering off war, and he this much when he didn't sell his stuff before like working in government. And I was like, too many numbers for my poor head. I can't keep up.
Yeah, I thought that chapter, shock therapy in the USA, was so like interesting in how like horrifying it was, I guess, because like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Dick Cheney, Bush, like all of these names and figures are they're so like ever present. Oh, and also Kissinger's presence throughout this whole like book. These are all just like names and people and institutions that are like everywhere in the US and in culture. And I think like getting into the nitty-gritty of what people were doing, and all the like illegal things that were happening, and also like the highly strategized like sort of like when she talks about the private contracting out of like of different things after 9/11, that versus like how the unionized like public sector workers was sort of the precedent leading up to that, essentially. And like, because like he says, you know, when he was like, because 9/11 is such like a big deal in the US, like, I mean, it's coming up, but like when she talks about here how through some combination of genuine feeling on Bush's part and the public's predictive desire for a leader worthy of the moment, these are some of the most moving speeches of Bush's political career. Like when he was talking about the first responders and you know, and like how he went on a tour of like the public sector, like we've gained new heroes, and so now it's like, okay, cost cutting is not no longer like patriotic, I suppose, but it is patriotic to have like private firms and like a security state and a surveillance state, you know. So
yeah, one of those names actually, that because the names that show up are not just American, they're like multinational big names. One of them that showed up in that chapter was Serco. So I work for a trade union, but we are part of local government, and like that's one of the companies that contracted out like the communication for local government is Serco. And they also, there was a big like scandal around them in the UK during COVID, because like test and trace system was Serco and it didn't work. And so I just thought, like, it's the same people, it's the same privatization of something that should be in local government in response to a disaster. Like that name popping up just made me think how like prescient it is, or how like it's still with us in so many ways. In fact, I actually did think, like, this is getting ahead of myself, but the last chapter, it was a lot like, people are aware of it now. And I was like, you haven't seen nothing yet, because she hasn't even seen the financial crisis or like any of that, how it's so still present, and like how the shock still happens. Like
like how different the privatization, like I think if applying the concepts that she delineates in this book to the global pandemic would be and her, I could definitely see her do a journalistic deep dive onto the privatization of healthcare, essentially in the like with the COVID-19 pandemic. Like I feel like that seems like something that she would do, like, or something along those lines, you know, or that's like a book that would exist or come out, you know, if someone did the journalism and research around it, because I think the basic principle that is, you know, kind of explored here is it's obvious, it's only like ramped up and has only gotten like has only evolved into different shapes or become new extremes or looked like new things.
It's got like more married to nationalism, I feel like that was one of the things she was talking about, the connection between like nationalism and neoliberalism, and I feel like that was even more extreme now, like around the world, whether you're talking about like Putin or Orban or Modi or the guy from Brazil who just left, I can't remember his name, but like people around the world have been getting more and more into that. I think you mentioned before that one of the things you wanted to talk about was like the geography of the book, like the way it travels around the world. And like, because she uses both geography and chronology as like the structuring elements of how she goes into the history of the shock, disaster capitalism and the neoliberal turn. She starts with torture, which I actually thought was a rather tenuous connection. I did think it was a bit like I get it, but it felt a bit like people, obviously the use of torture happened in many of the countries where she's talking about, but I thought it was a bit like a tenuous connection to be like, countries are like people, and the torture of people and the tortures of countries are similar, because it's it's like budgeting for a country is like budgeting for a household. It's like so many of these things are different. I feel like it's not really a
Yeah.
clear one-to-one thing. But
Yeah,
in terms of
it's not a like clear one-to-one analogy for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt like her talking about how like the CIA and like MK Ultra and the just the experiments and the state in like the US government's sort of interest and involvement in like developing torture methods in being able to like psychologically reshape people, specifically like during the Cold War, I think does sort of counter argument when it comes to how, like the rise of like disaster capitalism and sort of in opposition to like the threat of communism. And also, I think like that was something that I was sort of questioning as well initially of like she's saying that in these experiments that and in these like highly dangerous and like really messed up like torture facilities like what that were experiments, what happened was that like people were repeatedly like shocked or isolated in order for them to like try to become like a blank slate so that they could become like brainwashed or like espouse new ideals and a new ideology essentially. And I think that and then she makes the connection to like how they tried to do that same thing of like trying to eradicate the identity and the ideology and the beliefs of like a nation and in order to try to impose like them a new like ideology and system of government and social relations onto them, but it didn't really work. So I think like that is the parallel that made the most sense to me in that like human beings don't really work like that on an individual basis or on a collective basis. You can't like torture a bunch of people through bombing them and stealing all of their national treasures. Like when she talks about Iraq, like what happens in Iraq, and the way that you can't just put someone in solitary confinement for weeks and weeks and months and years and expect them to like then sort of do what you want them to. Like, I think that was an interesting parallel to me.
Yeah, that's kind of what Lily is saying here. Wrecking the economy and structuring so they're starving and isolated. It's not direct torture, but it still ends up with the same desperation. Yeah.
And then she does talk about like the specific the instances where there was torture, like there was mass torture, like under Pinochet and with under in Brazil, or like with like Abu Ghraib, or like she goes into all the ways that people in moments of like crisis and conflict like are able to experience that, like do get tortured in that like individual experience way.
Yeah, I did think like I think I mentioned that it's very clear that like Iraq hangs over this whole book. Like it's published in 2007, so that's what 6 years after the invasion of Iraq. And she's obviously been in Iraq and been researching, like that's where her journalism has been, is anti-war, stop the war coalition kind of journalism in relation to Iraq. And so there is a whole section, I think it's section 4, that is just entirely about Iraq. But then also even before that, like I thought, oh, this is so clearly set in this time or written in this time period from earlier on. She's constantly referencing Iraq. And like you said earlier, Kissinger and all those neocons are a big part of the book. They're like the big bad antagonists in the back of the book, or behind the book. And I thought it's interesting to consider like the time period in which it was written, because as we were saying, like in some ways she's prescient to now, but in some ways it does feel very much a product of its time as well. Like it's very like it feels like a Bush era book in a lot of ways, and I think that's partly obviously like the surveillance stuff is a lot less than like 15 years ago than it is now, so obviously there's stuff that can't be included in the same way, but it definitely, even like her like Keynesian leanings and all of that, it feels very much like of a 2007 like pre-financial crisis moment. I think there's a feeling of that, and it's interesting to see the way that her experience of Iraq and I think it feels like her shock, like her experience of Iraq is what prompted her to write this book and to like research into the way that it happened before. Did you get that sort of feeling?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like one of the things that I noticed a lot was like it's so obvious. And I also read her book, This Changes Everything, climate change versus capitalism or something. And it's very obvious to me how much she is a social democrat. Like she is very much a democratic socialist, and like she's a journalist, like she's very much a good journalist, but she's also very much like it in this book a democratic socialist. And I think like I think like
specifically like she's so into Keynes.
Sorry, what did you say?
Like she's specifically a Keynesian democratic socialist, like she's really into Keynesianism.
Yeah, and in that like New Deal sort of way, like I think like she and it's interesting because I think it's of its time, and it's also ahead of its time because this is the same logic that surrounded the like Occupy Wall Street like protests and stuff that happened like after this, you know, like I think it's this logic that carries through, you know, and I think that's like the bedrock of it is that social democrat like of the people, like these oligarchs who are all in cahoots with each other, who warmonger for profiteering reasons, are doing this at the expense of like the masses. And that sort of like and that that being with Kissinger and Bush and Cheney, but then, you know, a few years later, it's like, you know, Wall Street. I think it translates very much easily. And I think like we see that already in like how she talks about like Hurricane Katrina and or I don't know if we see that, but like we see the way that like she talks about how and she gets into that the like climate crisis element of it as well towards the end of the book too, especially in regards to Katrina, but like how the rich sort of are able to protect themselves. And in Iraq as well, like she talked about that too, like the militarization of like safety, and yeah,
I do like that she is never pretending to be like objective, like never doing that kind of New York Times, The Guardian, like I'm this neutral, even though obviously neutral objective journalism doesn't exist, but there's still that like that BBC vibe. She lets you know what she thinks and like gives you her opinion throughout the book, and she has a very clear perspective, and I like that she's very upfront with that because it allows you to like take what you need from it without like having to try and work out what she's like, what the perspective is and what's being missed. Like there are times I noticed she'd say something like, something about there's no evidence that this happened, but the question is worth asking. And I'm like, is it though? There's no evidence. So like there's like her perspective is very clear, but I prefer that, definitely prefer that to anything pretending to be objective.
Because you don't have the part, like it's that, and that's again the directness of her writing and how clear it is that she's speaking to an audience, that she's speaking to an audience that she's like, she doesn't think the reader is stupid, but she's also not trying to trick the reader into thinking what she thinks. She's presenting it. She's presenting us like, this is the fact of the matter, and this is my argument as to why the facts of the matter, like the history of what has happened and the experiences of these people, means that like my argument is correct, my analysis is correct. And like, you know, I think like the issues that do come up for me are some of the points that she does make that sort of like kind of prove how, or kind of indicated to me how like there was an element of fault to her underlying like logic to it, I guess, like to the political, you know, to the political like perspective and approach that she's coming at this from. Like for example, like for me on page or in the Margaret Thatcher chapter, Saved by a War, where she talks about how like the council estates were filled with the type of people who wouldn't vote Tory because it wasn't in their economic self-interest. Thatcher was convinced that if they could be brought into the market, they would start to identify with the interests of wealthier people who opposed redistribution. With that in mind, she offered strong incentives to the residents of public housing to buy their flats at reduced rates. Those who could become homeowners, while those who couldn't faced rents that were almost twice as high as before. It was a divide and conquer strategy, and it worked. The renters continued to oppose Thatcher. The streets of Britain's large cities saw a visible increase in homelessness. But polls showed that more than half of the new owners did switch their party affiliation to the Tories. And like that is and that comes up right after she talks about, within her argument surrounding like democracy versus authoritarianism and like what a free market and imposing a free market and the free will of a people. It's almost like she's saying that like free will and free market are like in opposition to each other. Like she is saying that because what conservatives and what neocons and like what the Friedman School of Economics is saying is that free market, free will are one and the same, and that is good and perfect. And she's saying no, those are not at all. But I think like that sort of fails when you consider the fact that like people's political interests are obviously within their like class interests. So like once a group of people are offered something better, then why would they have any, like why would they not do that? Why would they not choose that? And like whether the better is on the backs of or at the cost of anything or anyone else, like why would that matter to them really? Because using her same logic of like what she was talking about before in like how like Allende was like a really popular leader in Argentina or Chile before he was like overthrown. It was because like quality of life just improved for so many people. But it's like it's like that's because before that the country was pretty like destitute because natural resources weren't nationalized like that. But that's not really the case for I think like developed countries, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think, and I think like the way that she refers to or defers to like the Scandinavian model of economics and stuff is just like interesting and counterintuitive to like her argument, because she's saying that like the democratic will of the people will bring about a Keynesian sort of market and like social welfare and stuff that's against the free market. But like the truth of the matter that is presented here isn't necessarily that, you know what I mean? Like it's clear that like the wealthy people and people who stand to profit from and countries that stand to profit from like, you know, the systems that be and other people like, and even, but anyway, if that makes sense, like I feel like there was a lack that was just like kind of uncritical, like there's universalization of that was like, this is different, like you can't, that approach, like social democracy just is going to look fundamentally different in like South America than like anywhere in Europe because of the conditions of the countries.
Yeah, it's a different context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did think, yeah, because it's almost like that part of her argument is a similar style of argument to the people she's arguing against. So they're just like, no, if you just do it like this, then the outcome will be this. And they're like, in every country, you can just have completely free, unfettered markets, and everyone will eventually be fine. And she's like, if you just have like free democracy and the third way, then everything will be fine. Everyone will vote for social democrats.
Yes.
Like, well, you just said that people voted for the Tories when they gave them money, so it's not
exactly like that's not how it works. It's also sort of a utopian vision of like or a theoretical idea, I guess, of like how things work, I guess.
Yeah, people would just vote for the people I want if they were allowed to. Like that's kind of, she's just like, yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, I think like she also talks about West Germany versus East or she talks about like West Germany and why, because they had such like a strong history of like trade unionists and like Marxist organizers, and like because the Soviet Union was like nipping at their heels, they had to have such a strong like worker protections and like a social like government, you know, welfare programs and such. And like that was like it forced like Western powers that were that otherwise were really invested in like neoconservative economic policies to support that, because the alternative was like to concede West Germany. And like I think that, and she uses that almost as like the basis to discuss how, or she talks about that and then contrasts that to like how with Russia or like Poland, there was no, because like the Soviet Union was collapsing, or the US and other nations like forced it to like force Gorbachev into like dissolving his plan for like a social democracy in the Soviet Union. Like they living conditions just could be just totally squashed, and like people's just lives could have just been, you know, and like I thought that was interesting, or like that was like a good point, but it again sort of like it kind of it's she kind of misses, I think like that misses the mark in terms of like what, like for example, so in that chapter where she taught in the chapter Bonfire of a Young Democracy, where she talks about Russia, I think. There's like where all the change that happens with under Yeltsin, like Workers often did not even know that their factories and mines had been sold, let alone how they had been sold or to whom, a profound confusion I would witness a decade later in the state-owned factories of Iraq. In theory, all this wheeling and dealing was supposed to create the economic boom that would lift Russia out of desperation. In practice, the communist state was simply replaced by a corporatist one. The beneficiaries of the boom were confined to a small club of Russians, many of them former Communist Party apparatchiks, and a handful of Western mutual fund managers who made dizzying returns investing in newly privatized Russian companies. Before shock therapy, Russia had no millionaires. By 2003, the number of Russian billionaires had risen to 17. And I was like, well, communist state is already like an oxymoron. Like part of communism is that there's no state. But also like what's the state-owned factories and like them people not knowing who they were owned by and then who profited from them. And then the people who and then us seeing who economically profits from them. Like, I don't know, like that was an interesting connection to be made in terms of talking about like the Chicago school orthodoxy and like newly and privatized like economics and foreign shareholders like assets divided up and sold and stuff. It's very like it has the sort of like anti-communist left like approach that I think a lot of nonfiction a lot of like contemporary nonfiction has, because it's like palatable and it is the belief of the writer, but it's like it makes the argument sort of like weaker because it's like, well, if previously the reason why these assets weren't privatized and like sold off to random international mutual funds and stuff was because they were owned by the state that was run by the Communist Party, and all of the different assets and stuff that were like created and like or manufactured or came from like factories were with workers who like knew it was state owned until it wasn't, and then it was anyone. Like I think to condemn both of these things as like evil and bad on like a similar level is conceding to a right-wing idea and like a conservative neocon conception of like what like the economics of like equality like looks like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's definitely a touch of like horseshoe theory going on, of them being like, once you get round far enough, it's the same thing again. Not acknowledging the differences between the USSR and neoliberal, like how those things affected people differently. And it's not the same experience. But yeah, I guess especially because like considering Naomi Klein's age and stuff, like she would have grown up during the 70s, like she would have grown up during the Cold War, so that would have been her experience growing up as a like person in Canada in the 70s, what she would have been hearing and like how that would have affected the worldview. So yeah, it would be interesting to see if a younger journalist would have a different perspective, or an older journalist as well, like even older. I thought that because the initial thing is about the instructions about the Iraq War and about Katrina, and so I thought more of it was going to be about like capitalist opportunism, like about people taking advantage of like disasters and things in order to then input what they wanted. But it ended up being a lot more like conspiracy than I thought it would. And I don't mean like conspiracy theory, I mean like an actual like people conspiring together. There's a lot more like focus on forced shocks and like on them looking at like particularly the US in Latin America, looking at like governments coming in that they didn't like and so forcing a shock on them.
Yeah.
As the, as the hegemony, the hegemonic power, they forcing the shock on smaller countries, or even the IMF, which it was. She explained how the IMF is basically an arm of the US government forcing the shocks on Asian countries in the 1990s. I thought that, it was much more focused on that than I thought it was going to be. It wasn't what I wasn't really expecting that going in. Like, obviously, I know about the history of like the dirty wars, which she says it is wrong to call a war because it's not really a war when one side like crushes another.
Yeah.
But so about that history and about the fact that the US between 1950 and 1990, the US overthrew 72 democratically elected countries or something like that with the CIA. So I knew about that history, but I didn't know that that was going to be where we started and where we went from in terms of this. Like, even when she was talking about the Asian countries, the 5 Asian tigers in the 1990s, and the IMF crisis that happened there in 1997-98, she was talking about how it was actually fine, like the economies were actually fine, but because there was like fear about the economies and people were like hyping up through like propaganda about there being something wrong, that was what caused the issue, which does make me be like, money is fake. But I just thought it was interesting how much more conspiracy it is, because even in some instances I was like, you need to rework your argument because this is starting to sound like a conspiracy theory. Like, you haven't given me enough like facts to back up
Yeah. Like, I thought that I mean, she talks about like I think one thing about the conspiratorial element of this all is like how much of like a free market system relies on speculation and like this and like the speculative market. And like I think in the crisis work chapter, sorry, I love to read quotes, like I I love to use a pull quote, but like where she's like how the Friedman's crisis theory becomes like self-reinforcing, where like the more the global economy follows his prescriptions with floating interest rates, deregulated prices, and export-oriented economies, the more crisis-prone the system became, producing more and more of precisely the type of meltdowns he had identified as the only circumstances under which governments would take more of his radical advice. And this way, crisis is built into the Chicago school model. When limitless sums of money are free to travel the globe at great speed and speculators are able to bet on the value of everything from coca to currencies, the result is enormous volatility. I thought like that was such a great point and such like one of the overarching things that makes what sounds like conspiracies sort of like the truth of the matter. Like, and also is the reason why she focuses in on like the I'm forgetting the word for it, but it's the manufactured crises, like the forced like the shock of it, like the forced shock, as opposed to the stuff that like naturally occurs. Like the stuff that naturally occurs is because of the stuff that was that was like forced to occur, and then it's a cycle that feeds into itself, and like it reproduces more crises in order to like in order for Chicago School Economics to insert itself to be like, well, let's solve this crisis, and then by implementing those policies creates more crises to solve, and like it does that over and over again. And I think like that is why she focuses on both ends of it, because like she does talk about how like I think in the first half of the book she talks more about like the underdealings of like how the US government, the World Bank, and the IMF like actually work in order to do nefarious things to control like world economic systems. But then in the second half of the book she gets more into like what happens when like natural disasters like like what happens or even what happens like in the aftermath of like war, like I mean, I think when she was talking about how after Hurricane Katrina happened, like people were just there were no government services for so many people, but charter schools started popping up like this and started getting sold off everywhere because that was seen as like a potential solution to
Yeah.
things. Like I think that is like that was a really good example of how like crises begets more crises in terms of it presents itself like how all the conservative, Louisiana government officials were like, yeah, and the way to solve this is by hiring private contractors, and like that, and how that like obviously caused so much more suffering than needed, but like how that crisis response sort of like almost it also helps just like normalize that constant state of crisis that we exist under, in which like there's no expectation for the government to intervene. So it reinforces itself, and I think like that is a really major like that is one thing that this book really illustrates, I think.
That leads me on to like the final thing that I wanted to talk about was like how relevant is it still 15 years later? Like how prescient was it talking about today? And when you were just talking, I was thinking about like the chapter on Iraq. She talks about how the bombs are the big thing. Like she was like, does anyone want to talk about like how they're profiteering here? Like, can I talk to anyone about like these new private companies and the loss of government jobs and stuff? And they were like, the bombs. There's going to be bombs. And so it's like that's when you were just saying about like the crisis overtakes it stops anyone being able to function, and I guess that's how it links back to torture as well, because it's like your focus is on survival, your focus isn't on like the structure of the system and how to change structures, like your focus is on getting from one day to the next. I thought it was in some ways really prescient for like the way that it's continued, but I think her final chapter was a little too hopeful. Was my main feeling, my main takeaway. She's sort of like, we're getting to know it, and we're getting to like stop it. And like you were just talking about the charter schools in after Katrina, and when I was reading about that, I'd heard the term charter school, but I didn't know what it meant because it's like a specifically American thing. But in the UK, we have academization, which has happened to pretty much every single secondary school, which is age 11 to 18, and they've all been taken over by private companies, all of them. And so it's slightly different in that they have to do the national curriculum, which is set by the government, and the regulatory body has to be able to like go in and check them out and stuff. But still, all of our schools, since the financial crisis, have become owned by private companies. So those things that she's talking about, they have happened on such a like big scale.
Internationally, because the government is like one of the ways to like make money is selling off your public assets and public services.
And after like Thatcher and Reagan did so much of that, now like Bush and I guess it was Obama. Was Obama selling stuff off? I don't know much about economic policies.
Probably. I think it has more to do with the continuation of like private military contracts, most likely, because how many bombs Obama dropped. I feel like just from that perspective, that would make the most sense.
For the states, the military is like the biggest part of the budget, so selling off that bit is going to be like the most profitable for people to buy. Whereas in the UK, the NHS is the biggest part of the budget, and so like there are a lot more private companies in there now.
That makes sense.
One of the things she said that I thought was really prescient was she was talking about Blackwater and like its relationship to the US government, and she was like, one of the most worrying aspects of this industry is how unabashedly partisan it is. Blackwater, for instance, is closely aligned with the anti-abortion movement and other right-wing causes. It donates almost exclusively to the Republican Party rather than hedging its bets like most big corporations. Is it beyond the realm of imagination to conceive of a day when political parties will hire these companies to spy on their rivals during an election campaign? And I was like, didn't Eric Prince do that for Trump. Like Eric Prince of Blackwater and Donald Trump Jr. and Mohammed bin Salman had a meeting, and like Eric Prince was like paying people to infiltrate the Democratic Party. Like that literally happened.
Yeah.
Like, years after she wrote this book. I was like,
wow. Yeah. Because like, she's like, oh, this could potentially be a thing. And then you be like, well, that sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory, but then it actually happens. Yeah.
I also have been looking up at stuff like where she talked about stuff that like she was like, there was one guy who was disappeared in Argentina for trial, and she was like, and he's still missing to this day. I looked it up, he is still missing, and he's like 96 years old now. He's still missing. Nobody knows what's happened to him. I thought that was
like missing, and it's crazy because it's like people can just be like under like dictatorships, like real dictatorships, the people can just be like disappeared. It's like you can't even find like whether they died or not, or when or how. Like that is, and then the choice to be made of like whether someone becomes disappeared and no one knows anything about what happened to them, or they become like publicly executed, or they become a torture victim. Like this is something that happened in the invasion of like Iraq, Afghanistan in the past like couple decades. Like these are things that just occurred and people like know. And then that's also just like what happened under Pinochet, and that's what happened in Brazil, that's what happened in Argentina. Like I think like the fact that is the thing that is what occurs time and time again, like really, I guess that points to why she kind of frames and starts the book with like torture and in that way, because like there's it, like I it's like this, it's kind of this ubiquitous thing.
I did also get a strong, like I already didn't like Milton Friedman, but I did not know how involved he was in like absolutely everything.
Why was he in every country? Like he was the advisor to every country.
How did he get everywhere?
Invited everywhere.
Like after Tiananmen Square, he's there in Beijing, just like what are you doing?
He literally was everywhere.
It's like, I don't care if you call yourself a communist, do what I say and everything will be fine.
Or when he just came to like Chile or like Argentina, and he was like, and this is great, like this is like
the reason it didn't work is because they didn't do it hard enough. Like
when I read that, I was like, wow, like this guy really has some guts. Like he has a lot of audacity.
And how is he still being praised? Like how are people like, this guy's cool?
I think it's such like a grift and like pyramid scheme that like feeds itself. Like I mean, that's sort of like how capitalism like operates, I guess. That's sort of like what she is like. It's the Ouroboros, like the snake eating its own tail. Like it's such a scam on every level. But like because the sort of answer that like Chicago School of Economics people are going to give every time is like, just do what we're saying more and then you'll get a better result.
They're like Weight Watchers or something. They're like
like it's like, at what point is someone just gonna, and I think like that's why this book came to be, because it's like some people are like, well, at some point someone has to say, no, that's ridiculous, like you have to stop, like it has to end, and it's like it must end at some point, and it does, like it inevitably does, like people, you know, the troops get pulled out, like governments get overthrown, etc. But like it the impact is obviously like still there. Like I mean I was, one of my friends who is Chilean and like is in Chile was talking about how September, I'm forgetting the date, but like
it's the 11th, it's the same day.
Oh yes, how like that day is like such it's like such a traumatic day for like her personally, and because of how the whole nation was like affected, and how deeply it has shaped like the culture and dynamics of like the reality, the contemporary reality that like people
Yeah.
live in. It's like, I don't know. I think like even even I forgot whether she talked. I don't. Did she talk about the video game the video game that's like that was just like made by some random 18-year-old that was like shooting like random, like that was like simulating being a soldier in the in Iraq or something, that was like sponsored by Blackwater. Something like completely dystopian like that. Like, and I think about that and I'm like, wow, there really are some people who are like so deep. Like there's entire like nations of people and like communities of people who are so deeply traumatized and affected and like have their lives and families and like cultures and communities forever changed by like events that for other people are just like video games or
Yeah.
like don't even exist in the idea of like how their country operates and how the world works. Um,
Yeah.
and I think like that is one of the horrifying ordeals of like being an American who lives in the US is like the cognitive dissonance that like or the that plus the ignorance like that everyone has to live with to like sort of just exist, because it's like there is so much like bloodshed and everywhere you look, but like and if you think hard enough, but I think like people don't really. So
That's
yeah.
like here in imperialism. Like it's the
Yeah.
same. It's the same thing. People
Yeah,
do not think about it.
yeah.
But yeah, like you were saying, how it still affects people. Like she was talking about how Korea had the fourth highest suicide rate in the world after the IMF crisis, and I looked
Mm,
that up as well to see how that exists
mhm,
still, and it's gone down, but
mhm,
it is still the highest in the OECD countries. So like the developed countries still
uh-huh,
has the highest, and that is mostly because it has a really high suicide rate for people over 60, which is people who were like in their prime at that time. It has really high poverty in people over 60
yeah,
and really high suicide rates of people because of poverty and because there's a whole familial, like um, not wanting to be dependent on your children or like a burden to your children because there's not a social security. There's not like a state. They don't have like a state pension like we do here. There's
mhm,
no one to like look after them.
mm,
So that's the reason, and that is still like 30 years later, still a reverberation from the
yeah,
IMF crisis.
yeah, and I think, like, South Korea is still very much militarily occupied by the US, and, like, that's one of the reasons why it is, like, a first world country, like, because of how, like, the Korean War played out, like, it's I think, like, it's so it makes a lot of sense on, like, a broader scale that
Mm,
it is a country that, and she talks about, like, the relationship that, like, she touches on this a little bit of, like, how, like, suicide and, like, the amount of suicides that a
mm,
country has is sort of, like is itself a crisis of, like,
mm,
capitalism and, like, is just that's just the nature of it, like, you can
mm.
look at that as a direct like, the suicide skyrocketing after, the f like
All of the Soviet Union
yes.
in throughout former Soviet states.
Mhm,
Yeah.
and implementation of, like, those austerity measures and stuff, like,
Mm,
it and then, of course and, like, in Korea, it makes so much sense, I mean, like, it logistically, it's, like it makes sense, but, like, I mean, obviously, it's, like, really horrifying, but, yeah, I I thought that, like and she does talk about how, like, the rise of fascism is, like, really like, in Russia and Eastern Europe, and in,
mm,
like, Western Europe as well, like, the what the painful effects of like the austerity measures and like the economic just downfall is also what, leads to like proud populations that perceive themselves as humiliated by foreign forces and then look to regain their national pride by targeting the most vulnerable in their midst. Because it's like, it's true, like these countries were and are being humiliated and like exploited by foreign corporations and nationals, like in a very legitimate way. But like, people, there's, I think like she doesn't really get it. I think like there's a relationship between, okay, this is more like political theory in my mind, but like there's a relationship between like democratic socialism and like fascism that I think is interesting because like you can't, it's just not possible to eradicate like fascism through like purely democratic means, if that makes sense. Like it's not like something that you can necessarily like just get rid of in a sort of like natural way, because it's like fascism is also like not really like natural, like it emerges from specific conditions. So yeah, anyway, I mean,
and it's not really an ideology, so it's not like you can win an argument against it. Like it's a like, what's the word I want? It's like a series of things you do. Fascism is something you do. It's like active. It's not something you believe, if that makes sense. Like it's the way you go about things rather than what you believe, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like even if you look in Europe now, like you were saying, like Italy was one of the countries like hit hardest by the financial crisis, then exploited by the EU in their like recovery package to implement more neoliberal policies. Now has in its most recent election elected Giorgia Meloni, who is the head of the fascist party. But they're not. They say they're not fascist, but they are like Mussolini's descendants. They call themselves as well. So
yes.
like he's the fascist. So yeah, it's definitely, you can see the like trajectory that she's showing you. But her perspective on how to get out of it feels a little
kind of shiny. Or what did you say?
Utopian, like
yes.
Like if you hold hands, everything will be fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of her last chapters where she talks about Palestine was was really like effective for me, because of how like the way that she talks about like Palestinian workers and the labor of Palestinians versus like Palestinian land, like that, the Zionist project at first needed and relied upon the labor of natives. But then like as like countries full of like populations of multiple, like the population amount of like multiple countries combined gets like shipped in, essentially. Now there's no need for that labor anymore of the people already existing there. There's just a need for the land. And so all those people are like forced into the states surrounding them or into like refugee camps in perpetuity, essentially, or to face like military occupation and like the height of the sort of privatized military like
like their biggest export is military and surveillance.
Yes, I thought that was so interesting, and like that was like so fascinating because like it makes sense that technology and that type of stuff, like warfare, surveillance technology stuff, is like their biggest export. Because I've always thought of Israel as like getting as having a lot of US imports of like
a client state kind of.
Yeah, it's like a satellite state of like the US, and it also and it receives so much funding from US private companies, military contractors, but also the US government itself. Like So I've always thought of it as that, but it's like what like they elevate that because the conditions of Israel is that you can apply those like the military intelligence and military like technology in a way that is like just unfathomable. Like I think like I mean like I think like even every time I think currently every time I see news like of like Palestinians who are like murdered or imprisoned and it's like so regular. I feel like I see every couple weeks at least or like a new like bombing or something. I think like the way that this like in this like 2000 like 7 book sort of sets up the explanation of like of what crisis capitalism of like capitalism and imperialism's like that what that looks like in like the 21st century is in terms of like torture and technology and the global economy is like horrifying in how it is only escalated now, like built off of
well, because it's about expansion, isn't it? Like both of those things, imperialism and capitalism, is about growth and like expanding new territories all the time, which is what she talks about. Is like they need a new territory because like things are stagnating, so then they have to shock somewhere else. Because it's all about expansion and growth, so they have to constantly be pushing new people further and further, like into poverty or out of their place, depending on which one you're talking about.
Yes, and that's just like the modern day version of the reason why like colonialism like occurred, like the search for natural resources elsewhere, like and the desire to like get land because there's a rising population like in Western Europe. Like I think that it's very interesting to see how cyclical all of this is when you, in the analysis that is presented here, but also just like broader, like just history at large, I guess.
Okay, I think I've asked all of my questions about this book. If anyone watching has any questions, let us know. Sunny, if you have anything else you wanted to add that we didn't get to.
Yeah, I think we had a really good discussion.
Yeah, that was really fun. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy that I got to like read and discuss this.
Yeah, and thank you for making it, even though you've had a stressful day.
No, yeah, for sure.
So thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. It will be up on my channel if you want to go check it out afterwards, if you were late to join or whatever. And thank you. And Sunny's information, all the information about the book club is in the description as well. Our next book is Our Share of Nights by Mariana Enriquez, which is a big chunky piece of translated horror. So we're reading that for September, October. And we're reading that with Nate from Nathan's Nook. So that's probably going to be early in the morning my time because he's in Seoul. So time zones are going to be tricky for that. But thank you for watching, and I will see you again at the end of October to discuss that book.
Great. Bye. Thank you.